You know what's fascinating? When we think about medieval women, we often imagine them in castles or working in fields. But we rarely think about the most intimate aspects of their lives, the private realities they dealt with every month. Tonight, I want to tell you a story that's rarely told. A story about how medieval women managed something that every woman experiences, but that history often overlooks. This is a story about menstruation in medieval times, about the knowledge passed from mother to daughter in whispers, about the herbs and remedies and beliefs that helped women through their monthly cycles. So settle in, let the modern world fade away, and let me take you back to a time when women's bodies were mysterious, even to women themselves, when the moon's cycle and a woman's cycle were believed to be deeply connected, when managing monthly bleeding required ingenuity, privacy, and a deep knowledge of nature's remedies. This is an intimate story, a quiet story, a story of survival and adaptation, and women helping women through something that connected them all. In medieval Europe, people believed that everything in the universe was connected, that the movements of celestial bodies influenced life on Earth in profound ways. And nowhere was this belief stronger than in how people understood women's bodies and their monthly cycles. Let me introduce you to Eleanor, a young woman living in a small village in medieval England. And through her story, let's explore how medieval women understood and managed menstruation. Eleanor is 17 years old, and she's been menstruating for about 5 years now, since she was 12. But unlike modern women who understand menstruation as a biological process involving hormones and the reproductive system, Eleanor understands it very differently. She believes, as everyone in her world believes, that her body is intimately connected to the cycles of the moon. She's been taught since her first period that women's bodies follow the moon's rhythm, that the monthly bleeding corresponds to the lunar cycle, that there's something sacred and mysterious about this connection. The medieval understanding of menstruation was wrapped up in what they called humoral theory, the belief that the body contained 4 humors or fluids that needed to be in balance for health. Blood was one of these humors, and menstruation was understood as the body's natural way of purging excess blood, of releasing built-up toxins, of cleansing itself. This wasn't entirely wrong, actually. While the specific mechanism they imagined wasn't accurate, the idea that menstruation was a natural bodily process rather than a disease was surprisingly progressive for its time. Eleanor has learned to watch the moon carefully. When it waxes toward full, she prepares herself mentally and physically for her monthly bleeding, which she and the other women in her village call the flowers, or the time of cleansing. These euphemisms, these indirect ways of talking about menstruation, they're partly about modesty and partly about the medieval tendency to speak of bodily functions in metaphorical terms. Flowers is particularly interesting because it suggests blooming, fertility, something natural and seasonal rather than shameful or dirty. The knowledge Eleanor has about managing her period wasn't learned in any formal way. There were no books, no health classes, no pamphlets explaining menstruation. Instead, this knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter in private conversations, in whispered instructions, in practical demonstrations. When Eleanor had her first period, her mother took her aside, away from her father and brothers, and explained what was happening. She showed Eleanor the supplies they used, taught her the prayers and herbs that would help with pain, warned her about the social restrictions that would apply during her bleeding time. This transmission of knowledge from woman to woman, from generation to generation, created a kind of secret women's culture, a body of practical information that men knew little about and weren't supposed to inquire about. Eleanor's father and brothers know, vaguely, that women have monthly cycles. They know enough to give Eleanor and her mother privacy during certain times, to not ask questions, to accept that women sometimes need to rest, or avoid certain tasks. But the details, the practical realities, those are women's business, shared only among women. There's something profound about this, about how medieval women created spaces of privacy and autonomy within a society that generally gave them very little of either. In most aspects of life, women were under male authority, their fathers or husbands or brothers making decisions for them. But in this intimate realm of bodily functions, women had their own knowledge, their own practices, their own authority. It was a small space of female autonomy, but it mattered. Eleanor has also learned that different women have different experiences with menstruation. Some women in the village bleed heavily for many days. Others have lighter, shorter periods. Some experience terrible cramps that leave them bedridden. Others have minimal pain. This variation was understood in medieval times as reflecting different complexions or constitutional types. A woman with a hot complexion might have heavier bleeding. A woman with a cold complexion might have more painful periods. These categorizations don't match modern medical understanding, but they represented an attempt to make sense of the observed variation in women's experiences. The connection to the moon was more than just poetic metaphor for medieval people. They genuinely believed that the moon influenced bodily fluids, causing tides in the ocean and similar effects in human bodies. Women's monthly cycles, which seemed to correspond roughly to lunar months, were seen as proof of this connection. Eleanor has been taught to pay attention to the moon phase when her period starts, to note whether it's waxing or waning, whether it's full or new. Different moon phases were believed to influence the character of the bleeding, the severity of symptoms, even a woman's fertility. This lunar connection also gave menstruation a kind of cosmic significance. Eleanor's bleeding isn't just a bodily function, it's a participation in the great cycles of nature, a reminder that human bodies are part of the natural world, subject to the same rhythms that govern the tides and seasons. There's something comforting about this understanding, about feeling connected to something larger than yourself, about believing that your body's rhythms are natural and ordained, rather than random or shameful. The timing of menstruation was also used for practical purposes, particularly in understanding fertility. Medieval women knew from observation that pregnancy was most likely to occur at certain times in their cycles. The exact timing wasn't perfectly understood. They had some of the details wrong, but they knew there was a connection between menstruation, sexual activity, and conception. This knowledge was crucial for women trying to conceive or trying to avoid pregnancy, though the methods available for controlling fertility were limited and not very reliable. Eleanor has been taught to see her monthly bleeding as a sign of health and fertility. A woman who stops menstruating, unless she's pregnant or past the age of childbearing, is seen as potentially ill, her humors out of balance. Regular menstruation is a sign that the body is functioning properly, that excess blood is being appropriately expelled, that a woman is capable of bearing children. This is important in a society where a woman's value is closely tied to her reproductive capacity. But there's also a darker side to medieval beliefs about menstruation. Some people believed that menstrual blood was toxic, dangerous, capable of causing harm. They believed it could sour wine, kill plants, rust iron, cause mirrors to cloud. These beliefs, based on nothing but superstition, led to restrictions on what menstruating women could do. Eleanor has been warned not to churn butter during her period because it might not set properly, not to preserve meat because it might spoil, not to touch certain plants in the garden because they might wither. These restrictions were frustrating and limiting, but Eleanor has learned to navigate them. She uses her period as a legitimate excuse to avoid the hardest physical labor. She rests more during these days, claiming that the restrictions prevent her from working. She uses the cultural beliefs about menstruation to create space for rest and recovery in a life that otherwise allows for very little rest. It's a form of agency, using the very restrictions meant to limit her to actually gain some control over her time and labor. The quiet acceptance of this monthly cycle, the lack of shame that some later periods of history would attach to menstruation, is actually striking. Eleanor doesn't feel dirty or ashamed when she menstruates. She feels it's natural, normal, part of being a woman. Yes, there are restrictions and inconveniences, but there's no sense that menstruation itself is shameful or disgusting. It's just a fact of life, something to be managed practically, something that connects her to all the other women in her community who are managing the same thing. At night, when Eleanor lies in bed waiting for sleep, she sometimes thinks about this connection she shares with her mother, her sisters, the other women in the village. They're all experiencing or have experienced the same monthly cycle, the same bleeding, the same cramps, the same need for privacy and care. This shared experience creates bonds between women, creates understanding and sympathy that transcends individual differences. And in a world where women have little power, these bonds matter. They create networks of support and knowledge sharing that help all women survive and cope with the challenges of female embodiment in medieval times. Now, let's talk about the practical question that probably occurs to anyone hearing about medieval menstruation. What did women actually use to manage their monthly bleeding? Because there were no disposable pads, no tampons, no modern menstrual products of any kind. How did women like Eleanor deal with the physical reality of several days of bleeding each month? The answer is simpler and more labor-intensive than you might imagine. The most common menstrual product in medieval times was exactly what the term suggests: rags. Specifically, strips of linen cloth, folded and layered to absorb menstrual blood. Linen was the primary fabric for clothing and household textiles in medieval Europe, made from flax that was grown, processed, spun into thread, and woven into cloth through a labor-intensive process. When linen clothing became too worn for regular use, when it was too tattered or stained to wear, it wasn't thrown away. Instead, it was carefully saved and repurposed. Eleanor keeps a small wooden box near her bed, stored discreetly where her father and brothers won't accidentally open it. Inside this box are her menstrual cloths, carefully folded strips of soft, worn linen. Some of these cloths came from old shifts that her mother wore years ago. Some came from household linens that had become too damaged for other use. The cloth has been washed and re-washed so many times that it's become incredibly soft, much softer than new linen, perfect for the sensitive task of absorbing menstrual blood. When Eleanor's period begins, she takes several of these linen strips from her box. She folds each strip multiple times, creating a thick, absorbent pad. The exact folding technique varies, but the goal is to create something thick enough to absorb blood for several hours without leaking through to her clothing. She positions this folded cloth between her legs, held in place by a kind of belt or girdle worn around her waist. This belt, which she also keeps in her private box, has strips of cloth attached that tie around her waist and pass between her legs, securing the absorbent pad in position. This arrangement is not particularly comfortable. The cloth can shift and move as she walks or works. It can chafe, especially if it becomes damp. There's always the risk of leaking, of blood soaking through the cloth and staining her clothing, which would be embarrassing and also wasteful because washing stained clothing is difficult and time-consuming. Eleanor has learned through experience how often she needs to change her cloths, how to position them for maximum security, how to move carefully during heavy flow days to minimize the risk of leaking. Some women, particularly in rural areas with access to forests and wetlands, used natural materials instead of or in addition to cloth. Moss, specifically sphagnum moss, was prized for its absorbency. This moss grows in wet, boggy areas and has remarkable ability to absorb and hold liquid. Women would collect this moss, dry it thoroughly, and use it as an absorbent material. The moss could be placed inside the folded linen cloths for extra absorbency, or in some cases might be used on its own, though cloth was generally preferred because it was more comfortable against the skin. The advantage of moss is that it's disposable. After use, it can be thrown away or buried, unlike cloth, which must be washed and reused. But the disadvantage is that collecting moss requires access to the right kind of wetland, requires time and effort to gather and dry it, and requires knowing which types of moss are most absorbent and safe to use. Not all women had this knowledge or access, so cloth remained the primary option for most. The term rags for menstrual cloths has persisted in language long after the practice itself became obsolete. When we talk about someone being on the rag, that phrase comes directly from this medieval practice of using cloth rags during menstruation. It's a linguistic fossil, preserving the memory of a practice that lasted for centuries, that connected countless generations of women through shared experience. Eleanor's cloths require careful management throughout her period. She needs to change them several times a day, depending on her flow. During the heavy days of her period, usually the first 2 or 3 days, she might need to change cloths every few hours. On lighter days, the cloths can be used for longer periods. Each time she changes, the soiled cloth must be dealt with discreetly. She can't just leave bloody cloths lying around where her father or brothers might see them. That would violate the privacy and modesty that surrounds menstruation. So, she has a system. The used, bloody cloths go into a separate container, usually a covered basket or pot, stored somewhere private, often under her bed or in a corner of the room where men don't go. The cloths soak in cold water, which helps to release the blood from the fibers. This soaking must happen in private, away from men's eyes, because menstrual blood was considered something private and feminine, not for male viewing. The washing of menstrual cloths is a task that Eleanor and her mother do together, usually early in the morning before the men are awake, or at other times when they can have privacy. They take the soaked cloths to the stream or river, to a spot that's somewhat secluded where other women also come for this purpose. The cloths are scrubbed vigorously with wooden paddles or brushes, the blood gradually releasing from the linen fibers. Cold water works better than hot for removing bloodstains, something medieval women discovered through experience. Sometimes, if stains are particularly stubborn, the cloths are treated with wood ash, which has a bleaching effect, or with urine, which also helps break down protein stains. These cleaning methods sound unpleasant to us, but they were effective with the materials available. The goal is to get the cloths as clean as possible so they can be reused month after month, year after year. A set of good menstrual cloths, if well cared for, could last for many years. After washing, the cloths need to be dried, but this too must be done with some discretion. Eleanor and her mother hang the cloths in the sun, which has natural bleaching and sanitizing properties, but they hang them in a location that's somewhat hidden, perhaps behind the house or in a corner of the yard where passing men are unlikely to see them. There's a constant negotiation between the need for sunlight and air to dry and sanitize the cloths, and the need for privacy and modesty. The labor involved in managing menstruation this way is significant. Each month, Eleanor must prepare her cloths, change them multiple times per day, soak them, wash them, dry them, fold them, and store them properly. It's time-consuming and requires attention and care. But it's also just part of life, part of being a woman, no more remarkable or worthy of complaint than any of the other labors that fill her days. There's also an economic dimension to this. Linen cloth is valuable. Using cloth for menstrual purposes means that cloth can't be used for other things. Poor women, who have very little cloth to begin with, might struggle to dedicate enough cloth to menstrual use. They might have to make do with fewer cloths, washing and reusing them more frequently. Or they might resort more heavily to natural materials like moss or wool, which is less comfortable but more readily available. Wealthier women, who have more cloth resources, might have more menstrual cloths, allowing them to change more frequently and always have clean cloths available. They might employ servants to do the washing, sparing themselves the labor of managing their own menstrual cloths. But even for wealthy women, the basic system is the same. Cloth folded and secured with a belt, used and washed and reused in a monthly cycle. Eleanor stores her menstrual supplies with care, knowing they're essential to her ability to function during her period. The box that holds her cloths and belt is kept clean and dry. The cloths themselves are folded neatly when not in use. This organization might seem excessive, but it reflects the importance of these items. Without them, managing menstruation would be nearly impossible. She'd be confined to bed during her period, unable to move around without risking major leaking and staining. The cloths, humble as they are, provide mobility and dignity. There's something about this system, this ancient method of managing menstruation, that connects Eleanor to women across time and space. Her mother used the same method. Her grandmother did. Her great-grandmother did, going back generations. Women in her village, in neighboring villages, across Europe, they're all managing menstruation in essentially the same way. This shared practice creates a kind of solidarity, a recognition that all women deal with this same challenge using the same basic tools. The privacy surrounding menstrual cloths and their care also creates a space where women can be honest with each other about their bodies and their experiences. When Eleanor and her mother are washing cloths together at the river, they talk about how heavy their flows are, how many days they bleed, how bad their cramps are. They share remedies and advice. They complain about the inconvenience. They laugh about embarrassing moments of leaking. This frank conversation about bodily functions, this honesty about the messy reality of having a female body, it's only possible because men aren't present. Because this is women's space and women's business. As Eleanor folds her clean cloths and puts them back in her box, preparing for next month's cycle, she feels a mixture of resignation and competence. This is her reality. This is what being a woman means. But she knows how to manage it, knows the skills and knowledge required to deal with menstruation effectively. And that knowledge, that competence, it's a form of power. Small but real. In a world where women have very little power. She can handle this. She does handle this. Every month. And she'll continue to handle it for decades until menopause finally ends the cycling. It's not glamorous. It's not pleasant. But it's survivable. And survive she does. 1 month, 1 cloth, 1 washing at a time. The washing of menstrual cloths deserves deeper exploration because it reveals so much about medieval women's lives, about the intersection of practical necessity, social taboo, and female solidarity. This task, performed monthly by every menstruating woman, was fraught with complexity and required careful navigation of social norms and physical realities. Let's follow Eleanor more closely as she manages this crucial but hidden labor. It's early morning, just after dawn, and Eleanor and her mother are preparing to wash their menstrual cloths. They've waited for this time deliberately because the men of the household are still asleep or just beginning their day. Privacy is crucial for this task, not just preferred, but necessary. Medieval society had strict norms about modesty and what could be discussed or displayed publicly, and menstrual blood definitely fell into the category of things that must be kept private, especially from men. They gather their soiled cloths, which have been soaking overnight in a wooden bucket filled with cold water. The water is already tinged pink from the blood that's leached out of the fabric. Eleanor carries the bucket carefully, trying not to slosh the water, while her mother brings a basket with wooden paddles for beating the cloth, some wood ash for stubborn stains, and some lavender that they'll use to freshen the final rinse water. The walk to the stream takes about 10 minutes. They could wash closer to home, but the stream offers better water flow and also offers a specific spot where women gather for this purpose. It's not officially designated or marked, but all the women in the village know about it. It's a bend in the stream where the water is deep enough for washing but the current isn't too strong, where there are flat rocks perfect for beating cloth against, and where trees provide some screening from the main path. When they arrive, 2 other women are already there, also washing their menstrual cloths. There's a nod of recognition, a quiet greeting, but no elaborate conversation at first. The work begins immediately. Eleanor pours out the soaking water, watching the pink-tinged liquid flow into the stream and disperse. Then she plunges the first cloth into the cold stream water and begins scrubbing it against a flat rock, working the blood out of the fibers. The water is cold, almost painfully cold, especially in winter months. Eleanor's hands quickly become numb, her fingers stiff and clumsy. But cold water is necessary for bloodstains. Hot water would set the stains, make them permanent. So cold water it is, no matter the season, no matter how uncomfortable. She scrubs vigorously, folding and refolding the cloth to expose different parts to the water and rocks, working methodically to remove every trace of blood. Her mother works beside her, doing the same task with her own cloths. They work in a rhythm, a practiced efficiency born of doing this task every month for years. Scrub, rinse, examine, scrub again. The most heavily stained cloths require the most work. For these, Eleanor's mother takes some wood ash from their basket and rubs it into the stain. The ash has alkaline properties that help break down the blood proteins, making the stain lift more easily. After treating with ash, she scrubs again, and gradually the stain fades. As they work, the women begin to talk. Not loudly, not calling attention to themselves, but in quiet voices that don't carry beyond their small group. They're asking about each other's health, sharing news about family members, discussing practical matters of household management. But they're also talking about things they could never discuss in mixed company. The heaviness of their flows this month, the severity of their cramps, whether anyone has tried new remedies for menstrual pain. One of the other women mentions that her flow has been unusually heavy this month, heavy enough to soak through her cloths quickly, requiring more frequent changes. The others nod sympathetically. Another woman suggests an herbal tea that might help, a recipe using raspberry leaves that's supposed to ease heavy bleeding. This kind of information exchange, this sharing of women's knowledge about women's bodies, it happens here at the stream, where privacy allows frankness. There's also laughter, surprisingly. The women share stories of embarrassing moments, times when leaking occurred despite best efforts, times when cramping struck at inconvenient moments. These stories are told with humor, with the understanding that all women have experienced similar embarrassments. The shared laughter creates bonds, transforms individual humiliation into collective experience, makes the difficulties of menstruation more bearable through shared acknowledgement. Eleanor participates in this conversation while continuing her washing. She's grateful for this time with other women, this space where honesty is possible, where the messy reality of female bodies is acknowledged rather than hidden. At home, around men, such conversations would be unthinkable. But here, among women doing women's work, everything can be discussed. The washing continues. After the initial scrubbing and any necessary treatment with wood ash, the cloths are rinsed thoroughly in clean stream water. Multiple rinses are necessary to remove all traces of blood and any residue from the cleaning agents. Eleanor lifts each cloth from the water and examines it critically. Are there any remaining stains? Does it look clean? Does it smell clean? Only when she's satisfied does she move on to the next cloth. For the final rinse, Eleanor's mother adds lavender to the water. She's brought dried lavender flowers from last summer's harvest, and she crushes them slightly to release their fragrance, then swirls them in the water. The cloths are rinsed one final time in this lavender water, giving them a pleasant scent that will linger even after drying. This final touch, this attention to making the cloths smell nice, it's a small luxury but an important one. It makes the task feel less purely utilitarian, more like care rather than just chore. After washing, the cloths need to be wrung out thoroughly. This requires strength, twisting the wet linen until water stops dripping. Eleanor's hands, already cold and stiff from the washing, ache from the wringing. But it's necessary to remove as much water as possible so the cloths will dry more quickly. She works each cloth methodically, wringing, shaking it out, wringing again until it's as dry as she can get it by hand. The drying process requires its own careful planning. The cloths need sunlight and air to dry properly, but they also need to be hung somewhere relatively private. When Eleanor and her mother return home, they hang the cloths on a line strung behind their house, in a spot that's not visible from the main path, but that gets good sun exposure. The cloths flutter in the breeze, their clean white linen slowly drying in the warmth of the sun. Sunlight is actually an important part of the sanitization process, though Eleanor doesn't know the scientific reasons. The UV radiation in sunlight has antimicrobial properties, helps kill bacteria and fungi that might be present in the fabric. Medieval women knew from experience that sun-dried cloths stayed fresher longer, didn't develop unpleasant odors as quickly, so they prioritized sun-drying when weather permitted. In rainy or winter weather, when outdoor drying isn't possible, the cloths are hung near the fire inside the house. This is less ideal because the drying is slower and the cloths might pick up smoke smell, but it's necessary sometimes. Eleanor tries to do this when her father and brothers are out working, maintaining privacy even in the drying process. The cloths hanging near the fire aren't obviously menstrual cloths. They just look like any pieces of linen, so casual observation wouldn't identify them. But Eleanor still prefers to dry them when men aren't around, maintaining the discretion that surrounds menstruation. Once dry, the cloths are folded carefully and returned to Eleanor's box. They're stored clean and ready for next month's use. The whole cycle, from use through soaking, washing, drying, and storage, takes several days. It's a significant amount of labor, added to all the other labor of medieval women's lives. But it's necessary labor. Labor that enables Eleanor to function normally during her period, rather than being confined to bed or unable to move around. The importance of hygiene in this process, even in an era when the germ theory of disease wasn't understood, is striking. Eleanor and the other women intuitively understand that clean cloths are healthier than dirty ones. They know that cloths that aren't washed properly can cause irritation or infection. They might not know why this is true in scientific terms, but they know it from experience and from knowledge passed down from their mothers and grandmothers. There's also something deeply human about this practice, this attention to cleanliness and even beauty in managing a bodily function. The use of lavender in the final rinse isn't strictly necessary. Plain water would clean the cloths adequately. But the lavender makes the task more pleasant, makes the cloths nicer to use, adds a small element of self-care to what could be purely utilitarian. Medieval women, despite limited resources and difficult lives, still found ways to make their bodily care more pleasant, more dignified, more human. As Eleanor folds the last dried cloth and places it in her box, she feels a sense of accomplishment. Another month's washing complete. The cloths are clean, fresh, ready for next month. This task, repeated monthly for years, decades even, is such a routine part of life that it's almost automatic. But it's also important, part of the web of knowledge and practice that allows women to manage their bodies with dignity, despite the challenges and taboos of their era. The washing is work, yes, but it's also care. Both self-care and care passed between generations of women who wash together, teach each other, support each other in the perpetual cycle of female embodiment. Medieval women didn't have access to modern pain medication. No ibuprofen or acetaminophen. No prescription drugs for managing menstrual cramps or heavy bleeding. But they weren't helpless against menstrual pain either. They had developed, over centuries of observation and experimentation, an extensive pharmacopoeia of herbal remedies specifically for women's monthly troubles. Let's explore the herbs Eleanor uses and how she learned about them. The knowledge of medicinal herbs was primarily held and transmitted by women. While there were male physicians and apothecaries who worked with herbs, the specific knowledge about herbs for menstrual issues, for pregnancy, for childbirth, these were part of women's domain, passed from mother to daughter, shared among women, part of the informal but crucial body of feminine medical knowledge. Eleanor's mother taught her about these herbs starting when she first began menstruating. The first and most important herb was raspberry leaf. This common plant, which grows wild in many areas and is also cultivated for its fruit, has leaves that, when dried and brewed into tea, have a remarkable effect on menstrual cramps. Modern science has confirmed what medieval women knew from experience. Raspberry leaf contains compounds that help relax uterine muscles, reducing the severity of cramps. When Eleanor feels her period beginning, when she experiences that first twinge of cramping in her lower abdomen, she prepares raspberry leaf tea. She takes dried raspberry leaves from her stores, crushes them slightly to release their compounds, and pours hot water over them in a clay cup. She lets the tea steep until it's strong and dark, then drinks it slowly. The tea has a slightly astringent taste, not unpleasant but definitely medicinal. Within an hour or so, Eleanor usually notices her cramps easing, becoming more bearable. The effect isn't as dramatic as modern pain medication, but it helps significantly. Chamomile is another herb Eleanor uses frequently during her period, though for different symptoms. Chamomile tea helps with the tension and anxiety that sometimes accompany menstruation, helps her sleep when cramps might otherwise keep her awake, provides a gentle calming effect that makes the discomfort of her period easier to endure psychologically. She drinks chamomile tea in the evenings during her period, finding that it helps her relax and rest more effectively. But perhaps the most interesting herb in Eleanor's collection is mugwort, a plant that medieval women considered especially powerful for women's issues. Mugwort has a long history in European folk medicine as a women's herb, used to regulate menstruation, ease cramps, and support overall reproductive health. The medieval name for it in some regions was Mother of Herbs, reflecting its importance in women's medicine. Eleanor's mother taught her to use mugwort tea for promoting regular menstrual flow. If Eleanor's period is late or seems lighter than normal, which medieval women saw as a sign of humoral imbalance, she drinks mugwort tea for a few days. The herb contains compounds that can stimulate uterine contractions and promote menstrual flow. We now know that mugwort should be used carefully, especially by pregnant women, as it can indeed affect the uterus. But medieval women, through careful observation and transmitted knowledge, knew how to use it effectively and relatively safely. For severe cramping, Eleanor has another remedy: heat combined with herbs. She takes grain, usually barley or wheat, and heats it in a pan until it's very hot but not burned. Then she wraps this hot grain in a piece of cloth, creating a kind of primitive heating pad. This warm bundle is placed on her lower abdomen, and the deep, penetrating heat helps relax cramping muscles. Sometimes she adds dried herbs to the grain, chamomile or lavender, so that as the grain heats, it releases aromatic compounds that provide additional comfort. This heated grain therapy is remarkably effective, and it's something Eleanor can do for herself whenever needed. The warmth soothes cramps, provides comfort, and the weight of the grain bundle provides gentle pressure that can also help with pain. She often uses this remedy at night, lying in bed with the warm bundle on her belly, finding that it helps her relax enough to sleep despite cramping. For digestive issues that sometimes accompany menstruation, bloating and nausea and general stomach upset, Eleanor uses ginger and pepper. These spices are expensive, not everyday seasonings for a peasant household, but her mother keeps a small supply specifically for medicinal use. A tiny piece of ginger grated into hot water makes a tea that settles the stomach and reduces nausea. A few grains of pepper mixed with honey can reduce bloating. These remedies work, as modern medicine confirms, because ginger and pepper contain compounds that aid digestion and reduce inflammation. Eleanor also learns about the timing of herbal remedies, when to use which herbs for maximum effect. Raspberry leaf tea is most effective when drunk throughout the menstrual period, not just when cramps are severe. Chamomile is better used preventively in the evening, rather than waiting until she's too tense to sleep. Mugwort should be used in the days before the period begins, not during heavy bleeding. This knowledge of timing, of how and when to use each remedy, is as important as knowing which herbs to use. The preparation of herbs is also crucial. Dried herbs work better than fresh for most applications, because drying concentrates the active compounds. The water used for teas should be hot, but not boiling, as excessive heat can destroy some medicinal compounds. The steeping time matters too. Longer steeping extracts more compounds, but can also make the tea bitter and harder to drink. Eleanor has learned all these details through her mother's teaching and her own experience. There's also a spiritual dimension to herbal medicine that's important to understand. Medieval people didn't separate the physical and spiritual as completely as we do. They believed that herbs worked not just through their physical properties, but also through divine power, through the natural order created by God. When Eleanor drinks raspberry leaf tea, she's not just consuming a medicinal compound. She's participating in the healing power of nature, trusting in God's provision of plants for human well-being. Eleanor often prays while preparing her herbal remedies, asking God or specific saints, particularly female saints associated with women's health, to bless the herbs and make them effective. This prayer isn't superstition exactly. It's a recognition that healing comes from multiple sources, physical and spiritual, and that approaching illness or pain with faith and hope can itself be therapeutic. The herbs Eleanor uses are all locally available, either growing wild or cultivated in gardens. This local availability is important because expensive imported remedies aren't accessible to peasant women. But fortunately, many of the most effective herbs for menstrual issues grow readily in European climates. Raspberry grows wild, chamomile grows in fields and gardens, mugwort grows along roadsides and in waste areas. This accessibility meant that even poor women could have access to herbal medicine. Eleanor also learns about herbs to avoid during menstruation or pregnancy. Some herbs that are safe at other times can be dangerous during vulnerable periods. Pennyroyal, for instance, is known to be very effective at promoting menstrual flow, so effective that it can cause miscarriage if used by pregnant women. Medieval women knew this and used it very carefully, if at all. The knowledge of which herbs are safe and which are dangerous is crucial and is carefully transmitted. The belief in nature's healing power is strong in medieval culture. God created plants, medieval people believed, specifically to help humans with their ailments. Every plant has a purpose, a use, a place in the divine order. Learning about herbs, learning to use them properly, this is learning to read God's creation, to understand the natural medicine provided by divine providence. Eleanor approaches her herbs with respect and gratitude, seeing them not just as tools, but as gifts. When Eleanor feels her cramps easing after drinking raspberry leaf tea, when the warm grain bundle on her belly helps her relax, when chamomile tea allows her to sleep despite discomfort, she feels grateful for this knowledge, grateful to her mother for teaching her,
grateful to the generations of women before who discovered and preserved this knowledge. The herbs work, not perfectly, not as effectively as modern medicine, but they help. They make menstruation more bearable. They give women some control over their own comfort and well-being. And in a world where women have very little control over their lives, this herbal knowledge is precious, a form of power that can't be taken away. Medieval medical theory held that food had properties beyond just nutrition, that different foods could heat or cool the body, could affect the humors, could either help or harm during times of illness or bodily stress. Menstruation was understood as a time when a woman's body was in flux, when careful attention to diet could help maintain balance and ease symptoms. Eleanor has been taught specific dietary guidelines to follow during her period, and these guidelines reflect both practical wisdom and medieval medical theory. The fundamental principle is avoiding foods considered cold in nature. Now, this doesn't mean temperature, though that's part of it. In medieval humoral theory, foods were categorized as hot or cold, wet or dry, based on their perceived effects on the body. During menstruation, when the body is losing blood, understood as a hot, wet humor, it was believed important to avoid cold foods that might chill the body or disrupt the natural flow of blood. So Eleanor avoids very cold water during her period. In winter, this is easy, because all water is more or less cold, and she'd naturally prefer warm drinks anyway. But in summer, when cold water from the well might be refreshing, she's been taught to let it warm slightly before drinking, or to mix it with hot water to make it lukewarm. She drinks warm ale, warm herbal teas, warm broths. Anything that provides fluid without the cold shock that might, in medieval thinking, cause the menstrual blood to congeal or flow improperly. She also avoids very fresh, raw vegetables during her period. Medieval medicine considered most raw vegetables to be cold and wet, potentially difficult to digest and potentially disruptive to the body's heat balance. So during her period, Eleanor eats cooked vegetables, warm soups, cooked grains. The warmth and the cooking are believed to make the food easier to digest and less likely to upset the delicate balance of her menstruating body. What Eleanor does eat during her period is warm, nourishing soup, rich in dark, leafy greens. These greens, cooked thoroughly in broth, are understood to be strengthening, to help rebuild the blood that's being lost. We now know that dark leafy greens are indeed rich in iron, which helps prevent anemia from menstrual blood loss. Medieval women didn't know about iron or hemoglobin, but they observed that women who ate these greens during their periods seemed to have more energy and less fatigue. The soup she eats is often made with nettles, which grow abundantly and are rich in nutrients. Nettle soup, made by cooking young nettle leaves in broth until tender, is considered especially beneficial during menstruation. It's warming, nourishing, easy to digest, and provides the kind of iron-rich greens that help counteract blood loss. Eleanor finds that eating nettle soup during her period does indeed make her feel stronger, less tired, more capable of continuing her daily work. Honey mixed with warm water is another beverage Eleanor consumes during her period. Honey was expensive and used sparingly, but it was believed to be strengthening and energizing, perfect for a time when the body is under stress. A small spoonful of honey dissolved in warm water provides quick energy, tastes pleasant, and gives Eleanor a psychological boost. It's a small luxury, a small self-care practice that makes the discomfort of menstruation slightly more bearable. Bread made from rye is preferred during menstruation over wheat bread. Rye was considered to aid digestion, to be more strengthening than wheat. Modern nutrition confirms that rye bread does indeed have more fiber than wheat bread, which can help with the digestive issues that sometimes accompany menstruation. Eleanor eats rye bread with her soups and stews during her period, finding that it's filling and doesn't upset her stomach the way heavier foods might. Eleanor is also taught to reduce her consumption of red meat during her period, though for peasants this is hardly a sacrifice since red meat is rare anyway. The reasoning was that meat was considered very heating, very rich, potentially overwhelming to a body that's already dealing with the stress of menstruation. Fish, when available, was preferred. Fish was considered cooling and light, easier to digest, less likely to cause problems. The practice of eating smaller, more frequent meals during menstruation is also recommended. Rather than 2 large meals a day, Eleanor tries to eat smaller amounts throughout the day during her period. This keeps her energy more stable, prevents the stomach upset that can come from eating large meals when you're already uncomfortable, and seems to help with nausea if that's a symptom she's experiencing. There's also an emphasis on warm, comforting foods. Porridge made from oats, cooked slowly until it's creamy and served warm with a drizzle of honey if available. Warm broths sipped slowly. Herbal teas sweetened slightly. These aren't just about nutrition. They're about comfort, about soothing and caring for a body that's uncomfortable and under stress. Eleanor finds that these dietary guidelines actually help. Whether they work for the reasons medieval medicine claimed or for other reasons, she does feel better when she follows them. The warm foods are soothing. The frequent small meals keep her energy steady. The iron-rich greens do seem to prevent the weakness and fatigue she experienced in earlier years when she didn't pay attention to diet during her period. There's also a psychological benefit to following these guidelines. It gives Eleanor a sense of agency, a feeling that she's doing something to help herself,
actively managing her period rather than just passively suffering through it. In a life where women have limited control, this sense of being able to affect her own well-being through dietary choices is empowering in a small but meaningful way. The dietary recommendations also create a kind of ritual around menstruation. The preparation of special foods, the attention to what she eats and drinks, the mindfulness about diet. All of this marks menstruation as a special time, a time when her body needs particular care. This ritualization helps Eleanor mentally prepare for and cope with her period each month. Some foods are believed to affect menstrual flow itself. Heavy, rich foods are thought to make bleeding heavier. Light, easily digested foods are thought to keep bleeding at a moderate level. Eleanor pays attention to these beliefs, moderating her diet accordingly. Whether the beliefs are accurate or not, the attention to diet gives her a sense of participation in her own health. Interestingly, avoiding dairy products during menstruation is sometimes recommended, though this varies by region and family tradition. Dairy was considered cold and wet in humoral theory, potentially problematic during menstruation. Eleanor's family doesn't have much dairy anyway, as they don't own cows, so this restriction doesn't affect her much. But she's aware of it, knows some women avoid milk and cheese during their periods. The social aspect of menstrual diet is also important. When Eleanor is eating special soups or drinking particular teas during her period, the other women in the household know what's happening without it needing to be explicitly stated. The diet itself becomes a kind of communication, a way of signaling, "I'm menstruating and need to be treated gently," without having to say it directly in front of men. Eleanor's mother prepares some of these special foods for her, particularly when Eleanor's cramps are severe and she's less able to prepare food for herself. This maternal care, this preparation of nourishing food for a daughter who's suffering, is an expression of love and concern. The food becomes not just nutrition, but comfort, not just sustenance, but care made tangible. As Eleanor eats her nettle soup and drinks her chamomile tea, she's participating in practices that have sustained women through menstruation for generations. The specific foods might vary by region and season, but the underlying principles, warm and nourishing foods, attention to what the body needs, using diet as a form of self-care during a difficult time, these are universal to women's experience across the medieval period. And in following these dietary guidelines, Eleanor is connecting herself to that larger tradition of women caring for themselves and each other through the monthly cycle that defines female embodiment. Menstruation in medieval Christian Europe was entangled with religious beliefs about purity and pollution, about what was clean and unclean, about when women could or couldn't participate in religious life. These beliefs shaped how menstruating women were treated, what they were allowed to do, and how they understood their own bodies. Let's explore how Eleanor navigates the religious and social restrictions that accompany menstruation in her world. The biblical book of Leviticus declares women during menstruation to be ritually unclean for 7 days. While medieval Christianity didn't follow all Old Testament purity laws, this particular teaching had lasting influence. Many medieval Christians believed that menstruating women were impure, that their touch could contaminate sacred things, that they shouldn't approach altars or participate fully in religious ceremonies. This belief created a web of restrictions that Eleanor must navigate each month. In Eleanor's parish, menstruating women are discouraged from attending Mass, particularly from receiving the Eucharist. The reasoning is that a woman in an impure state shouldn't touch or consume the consecrated host, shouldn't approach the sacred mystery of Christ's body and blood while her own body is bleeding. Eleanor has internalized this teaching. When her period begins, she stops attending daily Mass. If her period happens to coincide with a major feast day, she attends but stands at the back of the church and doesn't approach for communion. This exclusion is painful in some ways. Eleanor is devout, her faith is important to her, and being told she's too impure to fully participate in religious life for several days each month is difficult to accept emotionally. But she's also been taught that this restriction is for her own good, that approaching sacred things in an impure state would be dangerous to her soul, that accepting these limitations is a form of obedience and humility. There are also domestic restrictions rooted in these purity beliefs. Eleanor is told not to bake bread during her period because her impure touch might cause the bread to fail to rise or to spoil quickly. She's told not to brew ale for the same reason. She's told not to preserve meat or make butter or engage in any food preparation that requires the food to keep or transform properly. These restrictions are based on superstitious beliefs about menstrual blood having polluting or harmful properties. But here's the interesting thing. While these restrictions are burdensome in some ways, Eleanor and other women have learned to use them to their advantage. Being forbidden from baking bread means Eleanor doesn't have to do that exhausting labor during her period. Being forbidden from brewing ale means she gets a break from that time-consuming task. Being told not to preserve meat means she doesn't have to do heavy work during a time when she's cramping and uncomfortable.
So what the patriarchal religious structure intends as restriction, women experience in part as reprieve. Eleanor leans into these restrictions, uses them as justification for resting more during her period, for avoiding the hardest physical labor. "I can't bake bread this week. I'm impure," she says, and her father and brothers accept this without question because it's religiously sanctioned. The restrictions become a socially acceptable excuse for self-care. There's also a belief that menstruating women should avoid handling crops or entering fields where food is growing because their presence might blight the plants or cause them to wither. Again, this is based on superstitious ideas about menstrual blood being harmful or toxic. But again, the practical effect is that Eleanor doesn't have to do agricultural labor during her period. She stays closer to home, does lighter work, rests more. Some medieval religious writers went further, claiming that menstruating women's gaze could tarnish mirrors, that their touch could rust iron, that they could sour wine or milk. These beliefs weren't universally accepted, and Eleanor doesn't really believe the more extreme claims. But they're part of the cultural atmosphere around menstruation, part of the web of ideas that position menstruating women as dangerous, polluting, needing to be separated from normal life. The concept of living in the shadows for a few days each month, withdrawing slightly from full participation in community life, becomes a way for Eleanor to create space for herself. She's not entirely isolated. She still interacts with the women of her household, still does necessary work, still eats with her family. But there's a subtle withdrawal, a stepping back that's both imposed and embraced. For young women experiencing their first periods, the religious restrictions can be frightening. Eleanor remembers her first period at age 12 when her mother explained that she was now subject to these restrictions, that she was now in a state of periodic impurity. It was confusing and a bit scary to suddenly be told you're unclean, that your body is doing something that makes you unsuitable for sacred activities. But over time, Eleanor has come to accept this as normal, as just part of the monthly cycle. There are also folk beliefs,
not necessarily religious but culturally powerful, about what menstruating women should avoid. They shouldn't touch iron, some people believe, because menstrual blood and iron have some mysterious connection. They shouldn't look at pregnant women or newborn babies, because they might cause harm. They shouldn't prepare medicines because their impurity might neutralize the healing properties. These beliefs vary by region and aren't consistently enforced, but they're part of the general atmosphere of restriction around menstruation. The Church's teaching about menstruation isn't entirely negative, however. Some religious texts acknowledge that menstruation is natural, created by God, part of the female body's normal function. These texts suggest that while menstruating women should be modest and observant of certain restrictions, they shouldn't be ashamed or feel that menstruation itself is sinful. This more moderate view offers some comfort to Eleanor, suggesting that her monthly bleeding is natural and divinely ordained, rather than evidence of fundamental female impurity. Confession practices around menstruation are interesting. Eleanor has been taught that menstruation itself isn't a sin and doesn't need to be confessed. However, if she accidentally violated restrictions, if she approached the altar during her period or touched sacred objects, that might require confession. This creates an interesting dynamic, where the biological process isn't sinful, but violating the social rules around it is. Some women, particularly in religious orders, interpreted the restrictions around menstruation as an opportunity for deeper spiritual practice. If they couldn't participate in public worship, they could engage in private prayer and meditation. If they had to withdraw from community activities, they could use that time for spiritual reading or contemplation. Eleanor doesn't take it quite that far, but she does find that the enforced rest during her period gives her more time to think, to pray quietly, to have inner stillness that's rare in her busy life. The social restrictions also create a kind of implicit understanding among women. When a woman excuses herself from certain activities, or seems to be avoiding particular tasks, other women understand without it needing to be stated explicitly. There's a shared knowledge, a female solidarity that comes from all experiencing the same monthly restrictions, the same need to navigate between religious teaching and practical reality. Eleanor has also observed that the restrictions around menstruation give women a kind of power through absence. When all the women in a household are menstruating simultaneously, which happens fairly often due to menstrual synchrony, suddenly a lot of normal work can't be done. Bread doesn't get baked. Ale doesn't get brewed. The household has to adjust, has to make do, has to respect the women's need for rest and withdrawal. It's a form of power, small and indirect, but real. As Eleanor rests during her period, avoiding the heaviest labor, using religious restrictions as justification, she feels a mixture of frustration and relief. Frustration that her body is considered impure, that natural biological processes are treated as contaminating, but also relief that she gets this monthly reprieve, this socially sanctioned rest. She's learned to navigate the complex terrain of religious restriction, using it when it benefits her, resenting it when it's too limiting, and always maintaining her own sense of dignity and worth, despite teachings that suggest she's periodically impure. Her faith is strong, but so is her practical sense, and she's learned to live with the contradiction. One of the most important and least discussed aspects of medieval menstruation is the network of female support and solidarity that surrounded it. Menstruation was something that connected all women, a shared experience that created bonds and fostered mutual aid. Let's explore how Eleanor and the women in her community support each other through their monthly cycles. There's a phenomenon that modern science has documented called menstrual synchrony, where women who spend significant time together tend to menstruate around the same time. Whether this is purely biological or partly influenced by social factors is debated, but it's observed in many communities. In Eleanor's village, the women who work together, live near each other, and interact daily do indeed tend to menstruate at similar times. This isn't perfectly synchronized, but there's a rough pattern where groups of women are dealing with their periods in the same week. This synchrony creates both challenges and opportunities. The challenge is that when multiple women are menstruating simultaneously, household work that women normally do must be redistributed or postponed. But the opportunity is that women can support each other, cover for each other, share the work in ways that account for who's feeling most capable on any given day. Eleanor is part of an informal group of about 6 women in her village, all roughly the same age, all friends and neighbors. They've developed a system where they help each other during their periods. If Eleanor is having particularly bad cramps one month, her friend Margaret might come help with her household work. If Margaret is feeling fine, but Eleanor isn't, Eleanor might prepare extra food that Margaret can share. They trade labor, share resources, help each other through the difficult days. This mutual aid is never explicitly negotiated or formally arranged. It's just understood, part of the unspoken rules of female friendship and solidarity. You help your friends when they need it, and they help you in return. During menstruation, when women are more vulnerable and less capable, this mutual aid becomes especially important. Eleanor knows she can count on her female friends, and they know they can count on her. The sharing of menstrual knowledge is another crucial aspect of this female network. When Eleanor first started menstruating, she learned from her mother, but she also learned from Margaret's mother and from older women in the village who shared their wisdom. As Eleanor has gained experience managing her own periods, she's shared that knowledge with younger girls. This cross-generational transfer of information ensures that each generation of women has access to the collective wisdom of all the women who came before. When a young girl in the village experiences her first period, it's not just her mother who helps her. Often, several women participate in guiding her through this transition. They explain what's happening. They share their own experiences. They offer practical advice about managing bleeding and pain. They welcome her into the community of menstruating women, making her feel that this is normal and that she's not alone. Eleanor remembers her own first period and how frightening it was. She woke up with blood on her bedding and thought she was injured or dying. Her mother, hearing her cry out, came quickly and explained what was happening. But it was the other women who really helped, who told her stories about their first periods, who laughed about their own early mistakes and embarrassing moments, who made her feel that this was a natural part of becoming a woman, rather than something shameful or scary. The women also share remedies and treatments with each other. If someone discovers a new herb that helps with cramps, she tells the others. If someone has an effective technique for managing heavy flow, she shares it. This sharing of practical knowledge makes all the women more capable, more comfortable, more skilled at managing their periods. It's a form of collective medicine, women teaching each other what works and what doesn't. There's also emotional support that's crucial. Menstruation can be physically painful, but it can also be emotionally difficult. Hormonal changes can affect mood, cause irritability or sadness or anxiety. Eleanor sometimes feels emotionally fragile during her period, more prone to tears or frustration. Having other women who understand this, who've experienced it themselves, who can offer sympathy and reassurance, is invaluable. The women talk about things they could never discuss with men. They complain about the discomfort, the inconvenience, the pain. They share their frustrations about restrictions and limitations. They laugh about embarrassing moments. This frank conversation, This honesty about bodily experience creates intimacy and trust. These women know each other's secrets, understand each other's struggles, support each other in ways that men neither could nor would. There's also a kind of mentoring that happens among women. Eleanor, who's been menstruating for 5 years, helps guide younger women who are newer to it. She shares what she's learned about managing pain, about washing cloths effectively, about navigating social restrictions. In turn, older women who've been menstruating for 20 or 30 years, who've developed extensive knowledge and experience, mentor Eleanor. This creates a chain of knowledge transmission that ensures no woman has to figure everything out on her own. The washing of menstrual cloths at the stream, which we discussed earlier, is a key site of female solidarity. This is women's space and women's time,
where they can be completely honest with each other. The conversation at the stream isn't just about menstruation, though that's often discussed. It's about everything: family problems, health concerns, relationship issues, anything that women need to talk about but can't discuss in mixed company. Eleanor values these times with other women immensely. They're a reprieve from the constant presence of male authority, from having to watch what she says and does. With other women, she can be completely herself, can complain without being told she's not being strong enough, can express emotions without judgment. This female space is psychologically crucial, a place where she can be vulnerable and still feel safe. There's also practical assistance that goes beyond just shared labor. If Eleanor runs out of clean menstrual cloths, perhaps because her period came early or was heavier than expected, she can borrow from another woman. If she runs out of a particular herb she uses for pain, she can ask a friend for some from their stores. This sharing of resources ensures that no woman is left without what she needs during her period. The women also protect each other's privacy. If a younger woman experiences leaking in public, older women will help her leave discreetly, will provide cloths to clean up, will help her change without men noticing what happened. They'll make excuses for her, will cover for her, will ensure that her embarrassing moment doesn't become public knowledge. This protection of each other's dignity is a fundamental part of female solidarity. Eleanor has noticed that the bonds formed through shared menstrual experience are particularly strong. Women who help each other through periods, who share menstrual knowledge, who provide emotional support during hormonal mood swings, these women become close friends, almost like sisters. There's something about sharing such intimate, vulnerable experiences that creates deep trust and affection.
The solidarity extends to respecting each other's different experiences, too. Not all women have the same menstrual symptoms or the same level of difficulty. Some women have relatively easy periods with minimal pain. Others suffer severely. The women in Eleanor's circle don't judge each other for these differences. They don't tell women with severe cramps that they're being weak or exaggerating. They don't dismiss women's pain. They believe each other and support each other regardless of individual variation. This female solidarity around menstruation creates a kind of alternative social structure, a network of relationships and mutual aid that exists parallel to, and sometimes in tension with, the male-dominated formal structures of village life. The men have their social hierarchies, their official roles, their public authority. But the women have this network of care and knowledge and support that sustains them through the intimate challenges of female embodiment. As Eleanor sits with her friends at the stream, washing cloths and talking, she feels grateful for these bonds, grateful for these women who understand what she's going through because they're going through it too. In a world that often seems designed for men's comfort and men's needs, this female community is a lifeline, a source of knowledge and comfort and care that makes being a woman in medieval times slightly more bearable. They're in this together, and that shared struggle creates strength. Even during menstruation, even when dealing with pain and bleeding and inconvenience, medieval women tried to maintain their appearance and dignity. This might seem surprising, the idea of paying attention to beauty during what we might consider a purely functional or practical time. But for Eleanor and women like her, maintaining some standards of grooming and pleasant appearance during their periods is an act of self-respect, a refusal to let a biological process completely dominate their lives. One of the primary concerns during menstruation is managing odor. Menstrual blood, particularly as it begins to decompose on used cloths before they can be washed, has a distinctive smell. In a time before frequent bathing or deodorant, managing this smell is challenging. Eleanor has learned several techniques for minimizing menstrual odor and maintaining a pleasant scent even during her period. She uses small cloth sachets filled with dried flowers and herbs, particularly lavender and roses. These sachets are sewn closed and can be tucked into the belt that holds her menstrual cloths in place. The herbs gradually release their fragrance, helping to mask any menstrual odor. The sachets sit close to her body, where the odor problem is most concentrated, and the pleasant scent helps her feel more confident and comfortable. Eleanor also uses what we might call herbal waters or tinctures for personal hygiene during menstruation. She makes an infusion of mint leaves, letting them steep in water until the water is strongly scented, and then cooling it. She uses this mint water to wash herself, particularly her genital area, during her period. The mint is refreshing, helps remove odors, and has mild antimicrobial properties that help prevent infection or irritation. Rose water, made from rose petals steeped in water, is another luxury Eleanor occasionally uses during her period. Rose water has a beautiful scent and also has mildly astringent properties that help with cleanliness. When she can access rose petals, either from wild roses or from a neighbor's garden, she makes this rose water and uses it for washing herself. It's a small luxury, but it makes her feel more refined, more cared for, more human rather than just a bleeding body. The clothing Eleanor wears during her period is chosen partly for comfort, but also with modesty and concealment in mind. She wears her longest, fullest skirts, multiple layers, ensuring that any potential leaking will be hidden and that the outline of her menstrual cloths won't be visible through her clothing. The extra layers also provide warmth, which is comforting when she's cramping, and create a kind of protective barrier that makes her feel more secure. She also pays particular attention to the cleanliness of her clothing during her period. Even though doing laundry is difficult labor, Eleanor makes sure her outer garments are as clean as possible during menstruation. This is partly practical, ensuring that any leaking doesn't create obvious stains, but it's also psychological. Wearing clean clothing makes her feel better about herself, makes her feel she's maintaining standards despite the challenges of menstruation. Eleanor also uses a very fine powder made from ground rose petals mixed with other dried flowers for her body during her period. This powder can be lightly dusted on her skin, particularly under her arms and on her neck, providing a pleasant scent that helps her feel fresh despite the reality of bleeding. The powder absorbs slight dampness from sweat and provides a subtle fragrance that boosts her confidence. Hair care continues during menstruation too, perhaps especially during menstruation. Eleanor braids her hair carefully, sometimes weaving in ribbons or strips of colored cloth as a way of maintaining her appearance and lifting her spirits. When you feel physically uncomfortable, when your body is doing something messy and inconvenient, having beautifully arranged hair can help you feel more in control, more put together, more like yourself, rather than just a collection of uncomfortable symptoms. The attention to beauty during menstruation is also a form of resistance against the social messaging that menstruating women are impure or disgusting. By maintaining her appearance, by continuing to care about how she looks and smells, Eleanor is asserting that menstruation doesn't make her less of a person, less worthy of dignity and beauty. She's refusing to internalize the negative cultural messages about menstruating bodies. There's also a social dimension to maintaining appearance during menstruation. If Eleanor lets herself look disheveled or unkempt during her period, people might notice and make assumptions. But if she maintains her normal appearance, continues to present herself well, most people won't even know she's menstruating. The ability to pass as a non-menstruating person, to blend in without drawing attention to her bodily state, is valuable in a society that treats menstruation as something to be hidden. Some of the beauty practices Eleanor engages in during her period are also self-care rituals that make her feel better psychologically. Braiding her hair with ribbons isn't just about appearance. It's a meditative, calming activity that helps her relax. Applying rose water isn't just about smell. It's a moment of gentle self-attention, of treating her body kindly rather than resenting it for bleeding. These small acts of care accumulate into a practice of self-love that makes menstruation more bearable. Eleanor has learned from older women that maintaining some pride in your appearance, some attention to beauty throughout all phases of life, including menstruation, is part of maintaining dignity and self-worth. Women who completely abandon self-care during their periods, who let themselves become slovenly or dirty, often feel worse emotionally. Women who maintain some standards, even reduced standards, feel better about themselves. The use of color in clothing during menstruation is also interesting. Eleanor avoids wearing her lightest colored clothing during her period, for practical reasons, obviously, but she also tends to choose her prettier, brighter colored clothing during this time. A red or blue tunic instead of drab brown, colorful ribbons in her hair. These touches of color and beauty help her mood, make her feel less dreary, counteract the tendency toward depression that can accompany hormonal changes. There's something powerful about this insistence on beauty, even during difficulty. It's a refusal to let physical challenges dominate completely, a determination to maintain humanity and dignity even when your body is uncomfortable. Eleanor isn't just surviving her period. She's living through it with as much grace and self-respect as she can manage. The women in Eleanor's community support each other in this too. They complement each other's appearance, notice when someone has braided their hair particularly beautifully or is wearing a nice color. They help each other maintain standards, offering ribbons or herbs or advice. This mutual encouragement in maintaining beauty during menstruation strengthens the bonds between women and helps everyone feel better. As Eleanor finishes braiding her hair, tucking herb sachets into her belt, washing herself with mint water, she looks at her reflection in the water bucket and sees someone who's menstruating, yes, but also someone who's cared for, dignified, beautiful. The menstruation is a fact, but it's not her entire identity. She's still Eleanor, still herself, still worthy of beauty and care. And that knowledge, that refusal to be reduced to just a bleeding body, gives her strength to face another day of her period with grace and self-respect. Women's approach to menstruation included not just managing the physical symptoms, but also recognizing it as a time for rest, for turning inward, for a kind of quiet contemplation that might not be possible during the busy rest of the month. Eleanor has learned to use her period as a time for restoration, for spiritual reflection, for practices that we might now call self-care or meditation, but that medieval women understood simply as necessary rest and spiritual attention. The first principle of menstrual rest is avoiding strenuous physical activity.
Eleanor is careful during her period not to walk long distances, not to lift heavy objects, not to do work that requires sustained physical effort. This isn't just about comfort, though avoiding exacerbation of cramps is certainly a goal. Medieval medical theory held that excessive physical activity during menstruation could disrupt the flow of blood, could cause the blood to pool or flow irregularly, could create imbalances that would lead to illness. So Eleanor finds legitimate excuses to stay closer to home during her period. She avoids the walk to the distant fields where crops are growing. She doesn't haul heavy buckets of water from the well, asking brothers or her father to do that task instead. She doesn't engage in the heavy physical labor of beating flax or threshing grain. She shifts to lighter work, spinning, which can be done sitting down, mending clothes, watching children, preparing simple foods that don't require heavy lifting or standing over a hot fire for hours. This reduction in physical labor creates time and space for rest. Eleanor sleeps more during her period, both at night and sometimes during the day, if her workload permits and she can find a private spot. The extra sleep helps her body recover from the blood loss, helps reduce fatigue, helps her cope with the discomfort and hormonal changes. Medieval people didn't understand the science of why extra sleep is beneficial during menstruation, but they observed that women who rested more during their periods were healthier overall. Eleanor also engages in what we might call meditation or mindfulness, though she wouldn't use those terms. She sits near the fire, engaged in quiet, repetitive work like spinning or mending, and lets her mind settle into a calm, contemplative state. The repetitive motion of spinning flax into thread is almost hypnotic, creating a mental space that's peaceful and restorative. She's not thinking actively about problems or worries. She's just present, watching the fire, feeling the warmth, listening to the sounds of her hands working. Sometimes Eleanor listens deliberately to natural sounds. Rain on the roof, wind through trees, birdsong in the morning. These sounds, particularly during the quiet of early morning or evening, create a sense of peace and connection to the natural world. She's been taught to see her menstrual cycle as part of nature's rhythms, and listening to nature during her period reinforces that connection, helps her feel that what her body is doing is natural and right, rather than shameful or wrong. There's also a spiritual dimension to menstrual rest that's important. Eleanor uses her period as a time for prayer and spiritual reflection, but a different kind than the formal prayers she says at other times. During menstruation, when she's withdrawn from certain religious activities, barred from receiving communion, she develops a more private, personal prayer practice. She talks to God, or to Mary, or to female saints in her own words, not using formal prayers, but just speaking from her heart. She prays for healing from cramps and discomfort. She prays for patience to endure. She thanks God for her body's fertility, for the capacity to someday bear children, if that's God's will for her life. She prays for other women in her community who are also menstruating, asking for their comfort and health. This private prayer practice, born from her exclusion from public worship, actually deepens her faith in some ways, making it more personal and immediate. Eleanor also uses her period as a time for self-examination, for thinking about her life and her choices. The hormonal changes of menstruation can make emotions more accessible, can bring up feelings and issues that are usually suppressed or ignored. While this can be difficult, Eleanor has learned to use it as an opportunity for honest self-reflection. What's troubling her? What needs to change in her life? What patterns of behavior or thought does she need to address? This isn't formal confession or anything organized. It's just quiet time alone with her thoughts, allowing herself to feel what she's feeling, to acknowledge difficulties and challenges, to think about how she wants to live. The menstrual pause from normal activities creates space for this inner work, this attention to emotional and spiritual well-being that's hard to find time for when life is busy and demanding. The concept of menstruation as a time of renewal or rebirth is present in medieval women's spirituality too. The bleeding is understood as purification, as the body cleansing itself, preparing for a new cycle. Eleanor is taught to see each period as an ending and a beginning, the end of one month's cycle and the beginning of another. This cyclical understanding of time, very different from the linear time emphasized in male-dominated religious teaching, gives her a different framework for understanding her life. She prays for blessings in the next cycle, for the month ahead. She asks for strength for the work she'll do, for patience with challenges she'll face, for grace in her relationships. This forward-looking prayer, this hopeful attention to the future, even while dealing with present discomfort, helps her maintain optimism and purpose. Eleanor also appreciates the enforced stillness of menstruation. Her normal life is so busy, so full of labor and tasks and demands, that she rarely has time to just be still, to sit quietly, to rest her body and mind. But during menstruation, cultural and religious restrictions enforce a kind of stillness. She has to rest more, has to avoid strenuous activity, has permission to withdraw slightly from normal demands. And while this is partly imposed restriction, it's also opportunity for restoration that's rare in her life. The women in her community understand this too. They speak of menstruation as a time when the spirit is renewed, when women's connection to divine or natural forces is particularly strong. Some women report having more vivid dreams during their periods, dreams that feel prophetic or spiritually significant. Others feel more intuitive, more aware of subtle emotional or spiritual currents. Eleanor has experienced this herself, felt during her periods that she's more open spiritually, more receptive to insights and understanding. The practice of longer, deeper sleep during menstruation is also restorative in ways beyond just physical rest. Dreams during menstrual sleep can be particularly vivid and memorable. Eleanor sometimes wakes from menstrual sleep with solutions to problems she's been worrying about, with new perspectives on difficulties, with a sense of clarity that wasn't there before. The combination of hormonal changes, extra rest, and the quiet, contemplative space of menstruation seems to allow for psychological and spiritual processing that's valuable. There's also the simple physical pleasure of rest after days of cramping and discomfort. When the heaviest days of bleeding pass, when the worst cramps ease, when Eleanor can finally sleep comfortably again, the relief is profound. That relief, that gratitude for the easing of pain, creates a kind of joy that's precious. She feels grateful for her body's resilience, grateful for having survived another period, grateful for the return to normal functioning. As Eleanor sits by the fire on the last day of her period, feeling the cramps finally subsiding, feeling her energy beginning to return, she feels a sense of completion and anticipation. Another cycle is ending. Another is about to begin. She's renewed,
restored as much as rest and reflection can restore her. Tomorrow she'll return to her normal work, her normal activity level. But tonight, in this liminal space between bleeding and not bleeding, she sits quietly, feeling the peace of having come through difficulty, feeling ready for whatever the next month brings. The menstrual pause, difficult as it is, has given her this: rest, reflection, and renewal. And that's enough. As we come to the end of Eleanor's story, let's reflect on what all this medieval menstrual knowledge and practice meant, how it sustained women through centuries, and what it tells us about human resilience and adaptation. Because the knowledge Eleanor has, the practices she follows, the understanding she's developed, all of this is part of a vast body of women's wisdom, passed down through countless generations, refined through experience, preserved through deliberate teaching. This knowledge kept medieval women alive and relatively healthy, despite lacking modern medicine, modern hygiene products, modern understanding of reproductive biology. They couldn't fully understand what was happening in their bodies each month, couldn't see the hormonal fluctuations or the shedding of uterine lining or the complex biological processes involved. But they could observe, could pay attention to patterns, could learn what helped and what didn't, could accumulate practical wisdom that actually worked. The herbal remedies Eleanor uses, raspberry leaf and chamomile and mugwort, these have been validated by modern research as having genuine medicinal effects. Medieval women didn't know the pharmacological mechanisms, didn't understand which compounds were responsible for which effects, but they knew through generations of careful observation that these herbs helped. That's remarkable. That kind of empirical knowledge developed without scientific instruments or formal research methods. The hygiene practices too, washing menstrual cloths thoroughly, drying them in sun, changing them frequently. These practices prevented many infections and complications, even though medieval women didn't understand germ theory. They knew from experience that cleanliness was important, that certain practices kept women healthier, and that knowledge, transmitted from mother to daughter, saved lives and prevented suffering. The social practices around menstruation, the female networks of support, the sharing of knowledge and resources, the solidarity among women, these created a kind of informal medical and social support system that helped all women through menstruation. No woman had to figure everything out alone. Each woman could draw on the collective wisdom of her community, could ask for help, could share what she learned. Eleanor is a link in this chain of knowledge transmission. She learned from her mother and from other women in her community. She's refined that knowledge through her own experience, and someday she'll teach her own daughters, passing on everything she knows about managing menstruation. The knowledge flows from generation to generation, each woman adding her own experience, the collective wisdom growing richer and more detailed over time. But this knowledge is also fragile, vulnerable to being lost. It's not written down, not formally codified. It exists in women's memories, in oral traditions, in practical demonstrations. If the chain of transmission is broken, if a generation of girls somehow doesn't receive the teaching, the knowledge could be lost. Eleanor knows this, feels the responsibility of preserving and passing on what she knows. The understanding of menstruation as a natural process aligned with lunar and natural cycles, while not scientifically accurate in the specifics, gave women a framework for understanding their bodies that was much healthier than the shame and disgust that would characterize some later periods of history. Eleanor doesn't feel ashamed of menstruating. She feels it's natural, normal, part of being a woman. That healthy attitude, that acceptance of the body's functions, is psychologically beneficial. The recognition of menstruation as a time requiring rest and special care, while wrapped in religious and cultural restrictions, nevertheless protected women's health by ensuring they got some reprieve from constant heavy labor. The restrictions could be oppressive, yes, but they also created space for necessary rest that women might not otherwise have been allowed. The value placed on female solidarity and mutual support during menstruation created bonds between women that sustained them through all of life's challenges, not just menstruation. The friendships formed through shared menstrual experience, the networks of care and knowledge sharing, these became foundations for broader female community and mutual aid that helped women survive in a male-dominated society. Tonight, as Eleanor lies down to sleep on the last night of her period, she feels tired, but also satisfied. Another month successfully navigated, another cycle managed without major incident or embarrassment. Her body, which caused her pain and inconvenience over the past few days, is now settling back into normalcy. The cramps are gone. The bleeding has stopped. Tomorrow, she'll wash her last menstrual cloths, fold them away, return fully to her normal activities. Under the light of the moon, that moon which she's been taught is connected to her monthly cycle, Eleanor feels a sense of peace. Her body did what bodies do. She managed it competently, using knowledge passed down through generations. She was supported by other women who understood what she was going through. She rested when she needed to rest. She maintained her dignity and her beauty despite discomfort. She survived, as she has every month, as she will continue to survive for decades until menopause finally ends the cycling. There's wisdom in this ancient knowledge, this women's medicine, this tradition of care and understanding. It's not perfect. It's not as effective as modern medicine. It's wrapped in some beliefs that aren't accurate and some restrictions that are oppressive.
But it worked well enough to sustain billions of women through thousands of years. It represents human ingenuity, women's resilience, the power of transmitted knowledge and collective experience. Eleanor thinks about all the women who came before her, who managed menstruation using similar methods, who passed down the knowledge that now helps her. She thinks about the women who will come after, her future daughters, if she has them, who will benefit from the knowledge she'll share. She's part of this endless chain of women, connected by shared biology and shared wisdom, each generation helping the next, each woman's experience contributing to the collective understanding. Sleep comes more easily tonight, deeper and more restful than the troubled sleep of the past few days. Eleanor's body relaxes completely, tension draining away, pain receding into memory. Her breathing slows and deepens, falls into the natural rhythm of healthy sleep. Outside, the moon continues its ancient journey across the sky, pulling tides and marking time, indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow connected to the cycles that govern female bodies. In the morning, Eleanor will wake renewed, ready to return to her normal work and normal life. But she'll carry with her the lessons of this month's cycle. That her body is strong and resilient, that other women understand and support her, that the knowledge she has is valuable and worth preserving, that she can endure discomfort with grace and dignity. These lessons, learned and relearned each month through lived experience, make her stronger, wiser, more connected to the long tradition of women who came before and who will come after. The medieval knowledge about menstruation wasn't perfect, but it was sufficient. It kept women healthy enough, comfortable enough, supported enough to survive and thrive despite the challenges of their era. And that knowledge, that tradition of care and understanding, it's part of human heritage.
Part of the story of how we've coped with the realities of embodiment across the centuries. Eleanor is a guardian of that heritage, a practitioner of that ancient wisdom, a link in the unbroken chain of women helping women through the monthly cycle that marks female life, from adolescence through menopause. Good night, Eleanor. Rest well in the knowledge that you've managed another month successfully, that you're part of a tradition larger than yourself, that your body's cycles are natural and right, that you're supported and valued and understood. Sleep deeply, heal completely, and wake tomorrow to a new cycle beginning, carrying forward the wisdom of all the women who came before you, and holding it in trust for all who will come after. The moon sets, the night deepens, and in the peace of post-menstrual rest, Eleanor sleeps, her body renewing itself, her spirit restored, ready for whatever the next month brings.